Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I have a little bit of a different filming setup today. I'm in my dorm room. I was in my dorm room for my Ted Bundy video too, but this time I decided to sit all my equipment on the desk in front of me and just let the background be whatever it is. Today we're talking about Edward and Austin Bryant. This is a very interesting case, one that makes me feel extremely upset. I learned about it from Danielle Hallen. I believe that's how you pronounce her name. I'll leave her channel linked down below. But anyway, I think we should just get on into the video because I don't really have much else to say. Edward Dylan Bryant was originally named Dylan Levy Bennett by his birth mother. He was born on May 11th, 1992, and he had brown hair and brown eyes. Austin Eugene Bryant was originally named Austin Jean Bennett by his birth mother. He was born January 29th, 1996, and he had blonde hair and blue eyes, and he also wore glasses that had very thick lenses. Originally, it wasn't just Edward and Austin. They do have a third brother. His name is either Dylan or James. I believe James is his birth name. I'm not completely sure. I just know that their younger brother is referred to both as Dylan and as James. So, it is known that the boys had a very difficult upbringing. They don't have much info on their birth mother, though. All we really know is that she had struggled with mental illness. She had depression, bipolar disorder, and PTSD from her childhood. She was put on very heavy medications for this, and this caused her to sleep most of the day. And taking care of her children then became very difficult for her because you cannot take care of 3 young boys while you're constantly sleeping. Eventually, the boys were put into foster care, and this was because their school believed that they were not being treated well at home. They said this because one day Edward had come to school with a dog bite on the back of his leg, and this was said to be because they lived next door, or it might not have been next door, but they lived close to a dog kennel. So the boys did spend a lot of time over there, and it was nothing too serious, nothing really out of the ordinary for them. So nobody really thought much of it in his family of him having a dog bite on his leg, but I guess the school looked at it differently. The boys then moved in with Edward Eugene and Linda K. Bryant in Monument, Colorado. In 1999 was when they moved, and they became their foster children, and they would still visit their mom on Wednesday nights and every single weekend. The Bryants had received more than $1,500 a month to care for the 2 boys. The boys were considered special needs. Edward had ADHD. I'm not really sure what Austin had, but he was also considered special needs, and all the Bryants had to do was prove that the boys were being provided education. Edward and Linda seemed to be very, very good foster parents. After a few months, they asked Edward and Austin's mom if they could fully adopt the boys. Their mom said yes, and they adopted their younger brother as well. She thought that it would be better for all of her boys if they were all together and in a home that she thought was a stable home. Austin was 4 at the time, and Edward was 7, and the adoption was finalized in March of 2000. After the adoption, the Bryants had began to adopt a total of 9 children. I believe this is including Edward, Austin, and their brother. Linda had 1 biological daughter who had also taken in foster children. Once the adoption process had started, though, things began to get a little bit strange. So Dylan was renamed to Edward Dylan Bryant. Austin was also renamed, but for him it was just his middle name, and I think maybe the spelling of his name. And Dylan did not like this. It is said that he wanted to keep his birth name, and he began cursing at his foster parents, well, his now adoptive parents, that his name was Dylan. This alarmed their mother because this was very out of character for him, and she also did not like that the boys were being renamed. I feel that if it was an infant and you wanted to rename them, that may be different. But when they are already 5 years old, 7 years old, they know their name. There's really no point in trying to rename them. Maybe give them a nickname, but renaming them, in my opinion, was very unnecessary. The boys' biological mom would frequently call them because now that they were officially adopted, it wasn't up to her if she got to see her children. Edward Dylan was always waiting to talk to his mom on the phone and tell her all about his day at school and just what was going on around them. And after a while, Edward Eugene, so the adoptive dad, began answering the phone. He would start making excuses as to why the boys couldn't come to the phone to talk to her, and eventually he told their mom to stop calling altogether. Christmas of 1999 was the last time that either of the boys had spoken to their biological mom. Since the boys were formally adopted, nobody actually had to come check in on them from the foster care system. Edward and Linda were required to have an interview every 3 years just to prove that they were being educated and to answer questions about the boys, but the boys did not have to come to the interviews with them, so nobody ever actually saw the boys. The couple continued to live in Monument, Colorado until 2005, and by this point only one incident had ever been reported, and that was that on April 6, 2002, Austin was said to have run away. He was only in the bushes by the garage when he was found by not necessarily patrol officers, but like the officers that were called. And he said he didn't know why he ran away. In 2005, Linda and Edward moved to Texas with all of their 9-something children, and shortly after this move, they had actually split up, so they now had 2 separate houses. They sold both of their houses they owned in Monument, Colorado. I wasn't aware that they owned 2 in Colorado. I just found that when I was researching it that they had sold both of their houses in Colorado. And I'm not really sure who mainly took over the kids. I believe it was Linda who took over all of the kids once they separated, but I'm not sure if Edward had any of them with him at all or not. Or if it was like with regular parents that are split and there's custody agreements and stuff like that, since they are adopted and legally their kids. In 2007, the couple filed for bankruptcy and they listed over $126,000 in adoption benefits as part of their income. They had a total of over 8 adopted children, and the 3 boys were the first of those to be adopted. They received around $5,500 a month in subsidies. It was around January of 2011 where the truth of a few things began coming out. So authorities were notified by 2 of the foster children that had been living with Linda's daughter, and their names were Ricky and Brian Pennington. These boys said that Austin Bryant hadn't been seen since around 2003 or 2005. And nobody had ever reported him missing. They said that Austin always had black eyes and welts on him whenever he was seen by these 2 boys, and Austin had told one of them stories about being locked in a trunk. There were stories about him being tased, going days without food. Linda would make him repeatedly run up and down the stairs, and he was horrifically abused. Austin would also tell these two boys about his brother Edward, but these two boys said that they had never seen Edward. So we now know that Edward was missing before 2003 when Austin went missing. Both brothers are now missing and nobody knows where they are. These two boys had no clue that there even was another brother. They just heard stories about it. And I guess they just summed it up to being stories because they had never actually met him. So as I said, both of the brothers, Edward and Austin, are now missing. And it was said later that the other children in the house were forbidden to talk about them. I guess Linda and Edward, mainly Linda at this point, because I guess by the time they were older, they were just living with Linda, that I guess she just didn't want rumors going around about the two boys, and she wanted the rest of the kids to basically act like they never existed. But as far as we know, with Edward at least, most of these kids might not have even met Edward. I don't know exactly how soon after she adopted the boys that they started adopting all these other kids, but there's a chance that if any of them saw Edward, it would only have been a few of them, because I guarantee they didn't go out and adopt 8 children all at once. That just doesn't happen. Authorities then went to find their younger brother, James. He was in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, because he was in the Army, and he wasn't officially in the Bryant home until 2001 because he was younger when the whole process was going through. When he moved in, he said that Edward wasn't there. Edward was only in the home a year before he ended up going missing. And James agreed that Austin had been horrifically abused while they were in the house. James said that he remembered Austin being locked in a footlocker, and he could hear him banging on it for hours trying to escape, and Austin would often eat out of the garbage can because he was so hungry and he was never fed, and Linda would also wrap him up extremely tightly in a blanket to the point where he was not able to move. And James said that he never asked any questions. I'm not really sure why, but he just didn't ask questions. I assume it's because he didn't want to get in trouble himself. And he believes that the Bryants had something to do with Austin and Edward disappearing. And he thinks that they had done something specifically to Austin. I'm not really sure if James was ever abused. I don't think he was, and I'm not really sure why he wasn't when the other two were, but apparently it was only these 2 kids that were ever abused. None of their other 8 foster children have ever reported having any issues at all. Authorities then went to question Linda and Edward Bryant. Linda claimed that the children lived with her the entire time, that Edward and Austin never went missing, and that everyone else was basically making it up and were in some sort of agreement to make this up. And she said that the boys had grown up at this point and she wasn't in contact with them. She said that they had went to visit their biological mom in Oklahoma and never came back. She didn't state when they visited their biological mom, but all she said was that they visited their biological mom in Oklahoma and never came back. So I'm not sure if this was after they were grown up or if they were still younger when they went to visit them. But I feel like if they were still younger and they didn't come back, she would have done something if they were supposedly with her the whole time, if that makes sense, because then that would essentially be kidnapping because it would be their mom taking them, so I assume they were older, but it was never said. Linda claimed that she did not kill either of the boys, and she denied any abuse allegations. She claimed that she made them run up and down the stairs as a form of exercise, and that she wasn't starving them. She was doing what was called delayed feeding, whatever that's supposed to mean. And she said that wrapping him up in a blanket was suggested by a therapist. Authorities then went on to question Linda's biological daughter and all of the children that had lived with them, and they were all told that Edward and Austin had been institutionalized. But this wasn't the reason Linda gave authorities, so right there's already something not adding up. And it said that the boys ran away at sometime in May of 2003, so I don't know if she's trying to say that this is the same time that they went to visit their mom and didn't come back, or if this is something completely different. But Edward, Big Edward, as I would call him, just to differentiate the two, so the adoptive dad, said that young Edward ran away in 2001 and that Austin ran away in 2005. So even their stories don't match up. So it makes it a little bit difficult, and for some reason I feel like I trust what Edward is saying more, because like everyone else said, nobody knew that Edward was there, that little Edward was there. They thought that, because Austin talked about him, they never saw him. So I don't believe that they ran away at the same time, because then everyone would have seen both boys at some point. They would have either seen both boys or wouldn't have seen either of them at all. Both Linda and Edward did say, though, that the boys ran away to be with their biological families, and police searched the house of their biological mother, and the boys weren't there, and they never had been. They never even went back to visit their mom. Edward and Linda continued receiving the money and subsidies every month, and they had passed every 3-year interview, because like I said, since they were adopted, nobody was coming to check on them. They just had the 3-year interview that the boys didn't even have to go to. So nobody was making sure the boys were actually there. And I feel like that is extremely, extremely just upsetting on the whole part of the system in general, because you would think you would still check on them to make sure they are there. Yes, they are adopted, but I don't know, because at the same time, then you'd have to say oh, well, biological families should be checked on too. I don't know. It makes me really upset that nobody ever made sure they were there. Linda also fabricated the school that Edward went to for the required proof of education. And I don't understand this, because why are people gathering information proving that they are being educated without actually checking it? Because they obviously didn't check to make sure they were in any of the local schools. They never checked to see if the school is actually a real place. They aren't checking. So what is the point of this information being gathered if they aren't going to be checked into? It just doesn't make sense. And investigators determined that Austin was enrolled at Monument Academy Charter School until August 2003, when he was supposedly withdrawn to be homeschooled. They were then not able to find any medical or school records for Austin and Edward at all, dating past 2003. So Linda would apparently print pictures of random boys on Google and put them in frames, so that when people came over for the interviews, they can say, oh, the boys they're at their friend's house and they aren't here right now. And they could look at the pictures and say that, oh, see, this is Edward when he was in 7th grade. This is Austin when he was however old. She just printed a bunch of random pictures to make it seem like the boys were still living with her. And James said that at one point, Linda tried to have him get one of his friends to pose as one of the boys during a social services inspection. And the appointment was then canceled and never rescheduled. No one ever stated why. But she was trying to get other people to just pose as these two boys rather than just coming clean about not knowing where they were. And in December of 2003, Medicaid was billed on behalf of Edward, but at this point, Edward wasn't even in the home anymore. Edward and Linda were then arrested in February of 2011, and they were charged on multiple counts of theft, conspiracy, forgery, and attempting to influence a public official. They were extradited from Texas back to Colorado, and they were held at a $1 million bail. At this point, they had collected roughly $175,000 in benefits for both Edward and Austin after both were no longer living in the house. And Big Edward said that he had no idea they were still receiving payments, which that I don't believe, because they were still living together at one point. It's not like they split right after the boys had gone missing. And to say that you had the boys with you, and then to say that you weren't receiving payments or didn't know you were receiving payments right there just doesn't make any sense. I'm sorry, I run off at the brain a lot when doing these videos. I get very just frustrated and angry with everything. And the focus was only on the money. And this is what makes me extremely upset, because authorities were focused more on the money that they were cheating the government out of rather than finding the boys. Nobody ever once actually went to look to find the boys, except for when they went to ask James if he knew anything. But other than that, nobody ever looked for any information involving the boys. Linda faced 148 felony charges, and Edward faced 13 charges, and it was all related to the money. None of the charges, not a single one of those charges, were for the boys' disappearance. After this, the other 5 children were then turned into the state. They were turned into wards of the state, and Linda was at one point asked what they should do with her, and she herself said manslaughter. And this angers me simply because if she's saying manslaughter, she knows that she did something awful enough to have manslaughter be a conviction. Like, I don't understand, because nobody's gonna say manslaughter just for cheating the government out of money. Like, she must know. Well, obviously she knows, but she must have done something so extremely terrible to have herself say that she deserved manslaughter. Linda then said that she would take all the charges, including manslaughter, which wasn't even a charge. She was the one that brought it up to begin with, if Edward were able to be kept out of prison to take care of the other 5 children. In 2012, Linda pled guilty to 54 felonies, 4 counts of theft, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit theft, and 48 counts of attempting to influence a public servant. She was sentenced to 42 years in prison. Edward pled guilty to 5 felonies and were sentenced to 30 years in prison. Again, none of the felonies had anything to do with the boys going missing. Authorities fear that they may be dead, which unfortunately I believe that as well, and their cases, as of now, remain unsolved. Edward Dylan Bryant would now be 27 years old, and Austin Eugene Bryant would now be 23 years old, and the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children had created updated photos of both of the boys in hopes of them being found and in hopes of anyone coming forward with any information. And anyone that does have any information or even thinks that they have any information regarding them is asked to contact the El Paso County Sheriff's Office at 719-390-5555, and I will leave that down below. There's another number that can be called as well. One is the sheriff's office and one is specifically for the investigators. Both will be left down below. That's all I really have for this video. If you guys have any cases you want me to look into, to do research on, to present to you guys, let me know down in the comments below. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.